3 minutes after 10 is the time, and I am torn. I have a sort of inner narrative that is being dragged inexorably towards this astonishing story on the front page about Kwasi Kwarteng, the new Chancellor of the Exchequer and co-author, of course, of Britannia Unchained, that book that described you as being among the laziest workers in the world. He's keen to end the cap on bankers' bonuses, a cap that I think currently stands at about 200% of your salary with permission of shareholders or the board, and 100% of your salary without that permission. But I can't do it today. Partly because our attention is also inexorably drawn in the other direction to events in central London, notably this remarkable queue. But also because I'm in quite a strange place this week. I don't mean the studio. Obviously, I'm broadcasting from the same place geographically. But it is a little odd to get past the pageantry. And I hope you don't mind if I say I don't particularly want to at the moment. I can absolutely reassure you that normal service will be resumed very, very soon. But sometimes it's as if you become a little bit defined by what you're being fed. So because everywhere you go, there is footage or discussion or coverage of the late Queen's passing, it's rather hard to focus properly on anything else. So I don't know whether or not I could treat the banker's bonus story with the utter fury and disgust that it so clearly deserves. I don't know that I can. I guess partly because of my gears. Sorry, this is all a bit self-indulgent. I'll get it out of the way rather quickly. I think a couple of my gears are defective this week. I think the focus, the understandable focus on matters royal, is so close to complete that the gear into which I would effortlessly move in order to launch a withering attack upon a Chancellor of the Exchequer who thinks that lifting a cap on bankers' bonuses is in any way appropriate or helpful policy making at this time. I don't know that gear is fully functional at the moment. It's as if it's in a sort of form of mourning of its own. So do remind me next week or ASAP to get completely stuck into that story at the first opportunity. So I could do it today, but I don't think I would do it justice. In the same way that I haven't yet got stuck into Liz Truss's claim that policies designed to help me with the cost of living crisis more than perhaps that person over there on the national living wage or that nurse over there, she believes that's perfectly fair. It's perfectly fair that I am going to get more help than you, perhaps, in the coming cost of living crisis. We need to get stuck into that as well. David asks, James, why is everyone saying passing rather than death? And it's a good question. It reminds me also to remind you that we're going to do, as things stand, we're going to do Mystery Hour today. That will be with us from 12. We dropped it last week. Feels like a lifetime ago, doesn't it? We dropped it last week because, it's obvious why we dropped it last week, I think. There's no need to explain that. And the answer, David, is euphemism, I think, very simply. It's just a slightly more comfortable word to use than death. The caller yesterday suggested we're very frightened of death in this country. We're very frightened of talking about it. And perhaps that is part of the reason why we choose the word passing in preference. So the queue. I'm not doing a comparison. I only mentioned Maradona's funeral in presumably in Buenos Aires because I was wondering whether there was anything comparable. You think of Iran when an Ayatollah passes and the crowds accompany the coffin through the street, hitting themselves on the head, and we sit there in a degree of Western privilege and perhaps condescension, and we think that's very odd behaviour. And yet, in many ways, if you were recently arrived from a country with no royal family or no history of forelock tugging or deference, you'd probably find the sheer length of this queue, never mind the practice of passing a coffin, a little bit baffling, a little bit befuddling. The phrase I've reached for, to my own surprise this week, is it makes sense, but it doesn't make sense at the same time. And the memory, my mum's over the moon about this, I can tell you. My entire life, I've looked at her slightly askance whenever she's reminded me or my own children that I watched the funeral of Edward VIII on the telly. It's a little bit like, yeah, all right, Mum. All right, Grandma. But I actually get it now. I do understand why she sat me at about 6 months old in my rocking chair in front of our little television to watch the funeral of the Duke of Windsor, who had briefly been Edward VIII. It's because even if you don't like... There's another question from Mystery Hour from Bob. What happens if presenters don't wear black? God, I dread to think. Bob. I certainly won't be finding out. Although perhaps in a few weeks I'll tell you an amusing story on precisely that theme. You don't have to have... I think if you're British, it's almost impossible to separate history from royalty. Think about it. What are we taught at school? Kings and queens. From the earliest memories you have of history lessons, it's kings and queens, right? You cannot separate history from royalty. It serves royalty very well, that, because it almost destroys the notion that royalty is optional. If royalty is absolutely intertwined with history, then surely the future has to be absolutely intertwined with royalty. Do you see what I'd never thought of that before? But it is a very... not unique to Britain, but I've only been educated in Britain. It's a peculiarly British thing. That absolute intertwining of history and royalty. You can't study history in this country, I don't imagine. I don't imagine anyone in this country has ever studied history from primary school through to sixth form without getting a fairly fat slice of royalty, of British royalty. You know, whether it's the divorced beheaded died, divorced beheaded survived, whether it's the James I of England, James VI of Scotland, whether it's Catherine of Aragon, whether it's, Queen Elizabeth, Bloody Mary, whatever it be, Mary Queen of Scots, the Stuarts, the Tudors, whatever it is, George III, George II, preferring Hanover to this guy. We've got it everywhere. And of course, an awful lot of our pastimes are plugged into it. The stately homes, the aristocracy, these dukedoms and these earldoms that can be traced back in some cases to 1066. Regular listeners will know that I find it very hard to resist at this point a little nod to the last Duke of Westminster, who, when asked for advice on becoming incredibly wealthy, said, I thought rather winningly, my advice to you, old boy, would be to have an ancestor who's best friends with William the Conqueror. Can't say fairer than that, can you? So you can't do it. And that's why my mum sat me in front of the telly that day, regardless of whether or not I've had Republican impulses in the course of my life or whether I find some elements of the royal family difficult. The fact that many of them seem set to be fired, many of the workers that have dedicated their working lives to the royals, to the palaces, are learning this week that they could be facing redundancy. Puts me in mind of that David Brent sketch, where he talks about good news and bad news. Some of you are going to be made redundant, but I got a promotion. That sort of attitude is not funny if you're on the receiving end of it, but it's hard to defend the fact that Charles will probably pay a smaller proportion in income tax, in inheritance tax, than other considerably less wealthy citizens of this country or subjects of this king. All of that I understand, and yet it's impossible to separate royalty from history. And that's why my mum sat me in front of the telly for Edward VIII's funeral. And that is why the queue of people to pay their respects to the dead Queen, to what is essentially a coffin on a dais covered in a blanket, I don't know what the correct phrase is, a velvet drape, perhaps. I'm not sure. There's probably a technical term for it, which someone will share with me imminently. That's part of the reason why you're doing it. It's as if you can touch history, I think. And that's why I'm not mocking it. Even if I was minded to mock it, I think respect would demand that one didn't. But that's why I think that doing it, queuing in this way, passing through Westminster Hall, is not necessarily evidence of excessive deference, excessive cap-doffing, forelock-tugging sensibilities, although that's baked into our DNA in this country in a way that I think it sometimes takes a foreigner to help us recognise. The New York Times has run a piece about the possible inappropriateness of having such an expensive pageant at a time of such economic difficulties, and some people have absolutely lost the plot about it, because there's nothing worse than a foreign newspaper suggesting that the incredible levels of deference that are drilled into us in this country from birth might be a little bit odd or silly. How dare they? They elected Donald Trump. They can't give us lessons on absurdity or silliness or profligacy. And both sides have got a point. Both sides have got a right. But that notion of touching history, for good or for ill, is what we'll probably talk about today. Or why are you queuing? If you are, I don't imagine many people are listening to us in the queue itself. But if you're thinking of going down there, then we'll double check on the numbers. We'll double check on the timings. Presumably, it's going to get bigger and bigger. At the weekend, for example, people might really pile in, and presumably, there's going to be a point at which you're told you can't join the end of the queue. You can't join the back of it because you're not going to get to the front of it in time for Monday morning when the doors close. All of that we'll share with you. Theo Usherwood can provide all of that detail. But I'm interested in the thing that confuses me. Two things confuse me today with coverage of the royal family. The first is partly this, although the touching history answer has filled a rather large gap in my confusion, actually. I have to tell you that. And I also have to tell you, I had no idea that was going to come out of my gob when I started talking at 10 o'clock today. That notion of you get to touch history, that's sort of a penny drop moment, right? Even if you're confused by what other people are doing because you've got no interest in doing it yourself, that combination of royalty and history being utterly intertwined in British education and British culture, and this opportunity to somehow touch history being offered to you as a completely normal member of the public is going to be, for millions of people, irresistible. Hundreds of thousands of people, irresistible. The other bit that's confused me is some people, usual suspects, I've checked, you always have to be careful about reading too much into social media bonfires. People are furious that Prince Harry and the Duchess of Sussex held hands as they came out of church. Genuinely furious. People are disgusted. People are outraged. So I do find my thoughts turning, not for the first time, to the question of where this vitriol comes from. How empty would your life have to be? How curdled would your soul have to be? How horrible your heart? How disappointed your own ambitions and romantic hopes? How broken would you have to be to not just find fault, but to find outrage in a man presumably touched by forms of post-traumatic stress disorder when it comes to royal funerals because of what happened to his mum and what he was forced to do behind her coffin, holding hands with his wife, who is no doubt in a state of fairly high anxiety because she's returned to a country where she's been the victim of absolutely appalling racist abuse from the very highest levels of the British media to the very lowest dregs of social media. They held hands. That's a very different kind of confusion. That's a confusion tinged with disgust. The confusion about the queue, diminished though it is now by that little combination of British education plus the chance to touch history, that's a sort of a warm confusion, a touching confusion, a confusion born of seeing people do things that are nice, that I don't fully understand, as opposed to seeing people do things that are vile, in the case of Harry and Meghan, that I don't really understand at all, except the obvious answer. It's not the fact that they're holding hands, it's the fact that her hand is brown that really boils people's proverbial. So there we'll go. Why? What does the Q say to you? I'll allow a degree of negativity. I won't allow viciousness. That's all. But if it says to you indoctrination, for example, here's a text. It's indoctrination, James. I wasn't subjected to it. I wish you luck with your recovery. I'm not a knee bender on this. I wouldn't be remotely tempted to make the journey myself. But I don't harbour any ill will or negative feelings towards people who have, who do, or indeed who will, or who want to. I don't get it, except for that touching history. But the appeal of that is not sufficient for me to want to do it. So maybe you're right. That's the kind of thing that I mean when I say negativity is permitted. It's welcome. It's not just allowed. It's welcome. What does the Q say to you? To this texter, it says indoctrination in a bad way. And there it is, your starter at 10. What does this queue, this incredible queue, this unprecedented queue, this enormous queue say to you? 0345 6060 973. 21 minutes after 10 is the time. Let me run through some of the texts and then we'll hit the phones. There's currently 2 phone lines free, so if you want to grab one of those, you can. The question very simply, and I know I don't really do, I don't know what you'd call it, 2-dimensional questions very often, but of course, even if the question is a little bit simplistic, a little bit 2-dimensional, there's no reason why the answers shouldn't be as complex or as nuanced as you'd like. So what does the Q mean to you? 0345 606 0973. I feel like I'm in a Black Mirror episode right now, says Chris. I've had a breaking news notification every time the Queen's coffin has moved. Every media outlet is dressed in some sort of mandated uniform, and the reports of protesters being arrested and assaulted is cheered by the masses. Last bit's not true, Chris, actually. I mean, as a member of the media dressed in a mandated uniform, I can tell you that the news of protesters being arrested and assaulted has not been uniformly cheered by the masses. In fact, I'm at risk of bringing a 52-48% ratio into proceedings so early, I think it's broadly disapproved of. Liz Truss, the House of Lords and the King are all unelected. Can't argue with that. Liz Truss is elected, but not by the country that she governs. And if you have a problem with that, there's a police van waiting for you. Nice turn of phrase. First time I've ever turned you off, James. I'm a Republican, and in my beliefs, Charles is not my king. Only God can be a king, not someone who is there because his ancestors pillaged through history. Don't read the Bible, don't read the Old Testament, whatever you do, if you've got a problem with some of the things that have been undertaken by, at least no king has ever sent plagues to earth. And take the eyes off, says Paul, the slavery, the opium smuggling and the imposed famines. Yeah, again, I don't think that Queen Elizabeth II was responsible for any of those, but exactly the point about the way royalty is taught in this country being, let's just say, rose-tinted. And Lee in Reading has a very interesting social circle. He says, it's great that people still want to pay their respects to a monarch. It reinforces my faith in the country that not everyone aspires to be a yardie or a drill rapper. I mean, far be it from me to give you advice on how to live your life, Lee, but, if that is really the sum total of the ambitions of your social circle and you find it so dispiriting and depressing, you could just change your social circle. I don't think I know anybody who aspires to being a yardie or indeed a drill rapper. 23 minutes after 10 is the time. Not even Keith. Susie's in Bromley to kick things off. Susie, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello,
hello there. A first-time caller, long-time listener, slightly nervous. You have to do that thing.
You don't have to do that, actually. But you've done it now, so on we go.
I've done it, so let's go on. So I'm actually I'm a volunteer marshal on the queue, and I do sort of like 8-hour shifts. I did one yesterday afternoon. I'm off to go and do one quite shortly as well. For me, the queue, for me personally, it's been wonderful to meet so many different types of people.
I'm sure, actually. It's a bit like my job, isn't it? But unpaid.
Very much so, yeah. Nice, thank you. I've met so many different, I've met people with incredibly shiny shoes, the likes of which I've not seen before, who are ex-service people. Yes. I've met grannies from, Commonwealth countries. And I've met a lot of young people as well. And your caller talking about, not aspiring to be yardies and drill rappers. I've met people on that queue who might appear to look like yardies and drill rappers, and they're still there.
Yes. Keith said, actually, just before we came on air this morning, he said there's no type. He walked all the way from London Bridge today, so if you'd been on duty, you'd have bumped into him. Yeah. He said there's no type. He said that it would be absolutely impossible to come up with a type from any demographic, from any sort of characterisation or classification of people. It is all sorts.
And I think for me as well, James, I'm a public servant, and a lot of the volunteers are public servants. And it's, for me personally, it epitomises 70 years of public service. I see Her Majesty the Queen as the ultimate public servant in a way, clearly far better remunerated than any of us.
Well, yes.
But, moot point. To have that scrutiny and 70 years of doing that, stepping into that role when your dad's just died and doing it forever, never retiring, is really meaningful to me as a public servant. It's something that I think a lot of us, aspire to live by that kind of example.
Yes, you lose me slightly here, although my respect for you is undimmed and for the sentiments you express. But I always think as public duty or public service as having a degree of sacrifice. And I know people talk about, because, if you go into some vocational services, you could be earning more money doing something else. No one becomes a doctor or certainly not a nurse or a firefighter for the financial rewards. And you're at great personal risk in some areas. I don't know. I never know whether there is sacrifice involved in royal public service. Maybe there is.
I think the sacrifice is in the scrutiny, and that's what we're all doing at the moment, isn't it?
Yes, we are, but there's no royal family without the scrutiny, is there? I mean, literally, there's no royal family without the scrutiny.
It's a self-perpetuating circle of that.
It is, and I think Harry's decision to try and live his life on his own terms is partly what's infuriated so many people, because it speaks to their own social contract and their own relationship with an institution that is kind of hard to explain. Final question, because I know that you've got to get yourself down there. How did you become a marshal? I didn't know about this. What's the?
We just got through the job I do. We got asked to volunteer, so we volunteered.
Oh,
it's all
I see.
Very, very complex, huge operational kind of like.
But are you being paid for the job that you normally do while you're marshalling, or are you doing this out of the goodness of your heart? If you don't mind me asking.
I think it's a bit of both.
Okay.
I think we can take some time off in relation to the time that we've given.
Time in lieu, as it were.
But exactly. But finding the time to take the time in lieu might be a different question.
Okay. And do you have a high-vis jacket?
I do. It's blue.
And what's written on the back of it?
Marshall is written on the back of it, but I'm not finding myself able to jump supermarket queues or people aren't buying me coffees.
And do you get to pay your respects yourself in a special lane as a consequence?
No, we do not. We need to join the back of the queue.
Oh, okay. Look out for Theo, will you? Have you got any care packages? Theo likes Kendal mint cake when his energy levels start flagging a bit. I don't know if you've got any Kendal mint cake. You can make do with a Kit Kat if you see him, Susie. All right. We have been
very pleased that some queue members offering us Murray mints as they walk past us.
I thought you said money then for a moment.
Yeah, right.
It's just like Del Boy Chot. I get you to the front of the queue. Thank you, Susie. Have a great day. Jonty's in St John's Wood. Jonty, what would you like to say?
Hey, James. Last time we were talking about inflation, so it's quite a different topic.
Indeed.
Yeah, I think this is not my relationship to the events. This is kind of what I'm thinking at a national level.
Yes.
Actually, at an international level, you've got people from America coming over.
Coming over especially. Well, I saw one, again, anecdotes are not data, but the notion that someone tweeted that they've got American friends coming over especially to join the queue, which is incredible.
It's amazing,
isn't it?
I think it's about in an age where you got massive change, massive uncertainty, hierarchies collapsing, and a lot of fear. I think people are drawn to meaning. I think human beings, we really need to connect with something meaningful. And whether you think the monarchy is meaningful or not, those people that feel that this has meaning to it, you can't deny that, they're kings and queens of England that we can trace back to the 500s AD, that's 1,500 years. That people, even if they're not thinking it through irrationally, there's a hell of a lot of emotional meaning and resonance behind this that I think is drawing a lot of people.
Meaning is, you're right. I mean, you preempted my question there. It's a good job I'm getting better at not interrupting people, because meaning, as you say, is very much in the eye of the beholder. It's closer, I think, Jonty, to like the line about life being nasty, brutish and short, and everything is actually chaos, and we only manage to impose a fairly thin veneer of civilization upon our otherwise feral impulses. Things like institutions like royalty and even aristocracy, they impose structure, and structure provides stability, and stability provides an antidote to chaos. It keeps the chaos at bay. So I think the more frightened you are of chaos, the more deferential you become to monarchy and aristocracy, perhaps.
I think it's also an attract. I think that's well put. And I think also there's a spiritual aspect to this. I think human beings are essentially spiritual creatures that need to have their spirits moved. It's not enough just to be eating and living and breathing air every day. We need to feel like our spirits are alive. Now, you can put that in the context of God, or you can put that in a more humanist context.
Yes.
But I think the royal family is brilliant at connecting us with that. And these ceremonies, they invoke the ceremony of the religious orders, which I think are deep within our psyches.
Yeah, for good or for ill. I mean, you qualified from the very start that you were analysing, not necessarily subscribing to what you describe, and it has to be true, doesn't it, that people are deriving something deeply meaningful from doing things that other people might find utterly meaningless. And there is, in a sense, a distillation of that line I stumbled over on Monday or Tuesday when I said it makes sense, but it doesn't make sense. I do think, and again, I'm conscious of not wanting to upset anybody accidentally today. Jonty, thank you. We'll be back to inflation before you know it, mate, I promise. I do think perhaps the biggest success the royal family has pulled off is persuading people that there is some element of sacrifice. Some people a little miffed by my suggestion that I struggle really to see that. Every girl in the world, every girl in a world touched by Disney is raised to believe that being a princess is the sum total of a young girl's ambition. So the actual real life ones deserving sympathy for the sacrifices they've made, I'm not completely sure about that. Perhaps we can discuss it further after the headlines with Holly Harris. 10:35 is the time. I've stumbled across a couple of rather jolly threads about what the experience of actually being in the queue will be like. So if you follow me on Twitter at Mr. James O.B., then I'll retweet both of those shortly. One by a BBC journalist, actually, Robert Ray, and or Rhea, and one by a Thames mudlark, a licensed Thames mudlark called Liz. And they're slightly different experiences, but both entertaining. And if you're thinking of going, then we are here to help. Despite the conversations that we might have about some of the confusing elements of the pageantry and the respect paying, we are here to help as a radio station and indeed as an individual. So I would urge you, for example, to go to lbc.co.uk and have a look at our running live commentary on queue length and expected times and anything we can do that makes your decision about whether or not to go and join it easier to make and provides you with the knowledge you will need to know what you can expect if you do decide to do it. However, some people listening to this programme will find it not just confusing but also perhaps annoying. I don't know what word you would want to insert there. Depressing. Enraging even, judging by my inbox. And there it is. Philip, for example, writes, as someone who is a lover of history, James, it still doesn't make any sense to me, even with your monologue this morning. To me, it's an institution that belongs in the history books and not the present day. It really feels like doffing the cap to birthrights to me. I'd be interested to know whether you studied history in this country or not, Philip, because I can't fault what you say logically. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But I think if you studied history in England, in Britain, you can't separate the two. History is royalty and royalty is history. And I think it's bad. I think we should study a lot more about other countries. We should study a lot more about the negative. This is why the kind of Daily Mail gets so cross about the idea that we should study less about. Right? I mean, look at Henry VIII, right? I often think this. And it's a beautiful musical. There's a musical in the West End. I haven't seen it yet, but one of my daughters tells me it's absolutely superb, called Six, which sort of it gives you a level of the status of Henry VIII's 6 wives in the public consciousness in this country. The man killed his wives and his closest advisors, often just so that he could nick their houses. The wars that he undertook, the money that he raised, he dissolved the monasteries so that he could keep his lifestyle intact and wage meaningless wars in pursuit of historical legacy. I mean, you don't get taught that. You end up coming out of Henry VIII lessons in English schools thinking that he was a sort of jolly old rogue, a bit of a geezer. He killed his wives and his closest advisors so that he could nick their houses. So you look at other countries and you think, oh, they're all a little bit backwards, aren't they, these banana republics? And then you turn up for a Tudors and Stuart lesson in a British school and you're essentially being told that a murderous sociopath was one of the finest kings we've ever had. So it is obviously crackers. So when I say royalty and history are inextricably intertwined in this country, I'm simply describing what I see. I'm not offering up a view on whether it's for good or for ill. I think it's probably largely for ill. But it is what it is, and it is who we are, and it is what we're looking at today in this queue. Which is why I'm asking you the question, what does the queue mean to you? Speaking of musicals, I saw Back to the Future last night at the Adelphi, and oh my goodness me, is there a bigger thrill in the theatre than an absolute humdinger of a musical? And if you're thinking, it's just a rip-off of the film, it's not. They've changed the storyline quite a lot. I won't give you any spoilers, except to say they still go back to the past and back to the future. But oh boy, great songs, great performances, astonishing. Really brilliant choreography, music. If you get the chance to see Back to the Future at the Adelphi, grab it with both hands. Grab it with all your hands. However many hands, just grab it. It's superb, absolutely brilliant, and just what I needed actually this week. Again, a minute's silence before the performance. We all stand up and we all observe a minute's silence. And if you were trying to explain to somebody who'd spent no time at all in a country with a royal family why that was, I think you'd struggle. It makes sense, but it doesn't make sense. Gilbert is in Harlow. Gilbert, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, because I've just been confused about why they haven't put in like a timed ticketing system, which they could easily do. We know how to do this. We don't need to have 10-mile queues. We know exactly how to do this, manage this sort of operation without that. You could easily reduce everyone's waiting time down to probably, a couple of hours.
That's a really interesting observation, because I think you know the answer, don't you?
Well, I've got two ideas. Yeah, obviously one is because then you wouldn't have, because they're trying to establish, this isn't really about the Queen so much as they're trying to establish a new king, and they want the pictures, they want the visuals of people in devotion to the monarch, to the royalty, to the crown. Yeah. They want to show how. And then it's also, there's a quasi-religious, it feels like, sort of almost like a penitence, because it's going to be painful in that queue, because it's not just going to be waiting for 12 hours.
It's medieval.
They're going to be, the queue never stops moving, so you don't even get to rest. You just have to, it's awful.
Well, listen, I'm not going to argue with you, but you haven't been in it, and some of the people who have been in it are very happy, thank you very much, with the experiences that they've had, which is why I'm tweeting these two rather excellent threads on what the experience is like. But it is a bit medieval. There was a lad at my school, Gilbert, who was a bit eccentric, and he used to go up to communion on his knees. He used to sort of shuffle up to the front of the church on his knees like he was demonstrating how he was more dedicated to God than everybody else was. And that is encouraged by this sort of queuing. It's an expression of dedication, and the longer the queue and the more difficult perhaps the queuing is, the more dedicated you appear, and therefore the more solidified the whole concept of monarchy becomes.
Yeah, well, and I think there's also there's a second thing. It's because most of us, as we, 70% of us or whatever, have not had a monarch imposed upon us. We were born with a monarch, and we were conditioned to feel brought up to feel favourably towards her, and so probably have just accepted her. And partly because she's a queen, and I think it's maybe easier to accept a queen because a queen has a more natural place, like a queen bee. The symbolism of a queen is easier. And now we've got to have a king imposed upon us as adults, and we already know what he's like. We've seen what he's up to, and it's going to be hard for them. And I think you're right.
I think you're right.
Thing is, he
doesn't have the mystique, the camouflage of mystique that the Queen managed to maintain. I mean, he's defender of the faith, and I know he said he's going to be defender of all the faiths, but he is also, a known. Well, we know of at least one of the 10 Commandments that he's absolutely driven a gilded coach and horses through in the course of his life, don't we? So it's an odd juxtaposition of knowledge and history, currency, present time knowledge and historical context. Do you agree with that line about history and royalty being intertwined, though, even if that intertwining you think may now start fraying with the new monarch?
Well, I think it's because it's less relevant because obviously the reason why is because monarchs played a direct role in the shaping and the governing of the nation, but now now it has become much more symbolic. It's less important, isn't it? It's less. We could.
Well, it is to you. It isn't. It isn't to them. Well, maybe it is to them. Some of them, I don't know that idea. But I do think there's something medieval about the queuing. Actually, about Chaucer and the pilgrimages. And although that was obviously religious in the offing, that attempt to that the divine right of kings for centuries in this country taught that people were put on the throne by God. rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate. God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. But I hadn't thought of that. The idea that the longer the queue is, and in many ways, despite the best efforts of Susie and her fellow marshals, in many ways, the longer it is, the more what's the sort of adjective for penance? It's not penitent, is it? I can't say penancy. That's not a word. The longer the queue is, the more it looks like a penance to be in it. You're paying, you're suffering to show your dedication and your devotion on a tough pilgrimage to God on this sort of occasion, to monarchy itself, to the Queen, the late Queen in particular, but also to monarchy itself. I like that a lot, actually, Gilbert. Straight, you and Jonty, joint top of the class on this one. 10:45 is the time. 10:48 is the time. A slightly unexpected illustration here from Jean, who taught Kings and Queens to a Year 2, Year 3 class, as per the curriculum, of what I was saying about the possible sanitisation of royal history. Teaching royalty as an inextricable part of British history involves rose-tinted spectacles, but I didn't see this one coming, I have to be honest. I taught Kings and Queens to a Year 2, 3 class as per curriculum, James. The children were asked to illustrate their work. A pupil showed her picture, which showed 3 people in a bed. When I asked her what was going on, she said, "That's Henry and 2 of his wives." Well, and Lindy has a different experience, which is perhaps a little more uplifting. Hi, James. No, not Lindy, I beg your pardon. Heather in South Derbyshire. My almost 7-year-old has learnt about Henry VIII. She's now worried that we've got a king instead of a queen in case he's a bad man like Henry VIII was. So I think education in this field has improved since I was at school, James. So do I, Heather. Thank you. And Lindy sent a rather different message saying it's nationalism, James. It's people saying that this is our history and no one else's. I wonder whether that plays into the Meghan Markle story as well. Coming over here, signing up, joining in, stealing our prince, joining in with our pageantry when you're not just foreign, but you're... Yeah, we may get into that in the second hour. Is Theo Usherwood ready? We're going to go... Shall we? Theo Usherwood, have you been home since we last spoke?
Yes, I have, but I've come back to very close to the front of the queue, just by Lambeth Bridge, to check on progress. And what I've discovered is that the people I'm speaking to now joined at around 8 o'clock this morning, a couple of miles down at Southwark Cathedral. They've probably got another 2 hours to go until they get into 3 hours. Sorry, one of the helpers is just saying to me that if you're here, you've got another 3 hours to go until you go into Westminster Hall.
Fake news. Thank you, helper. Thank you, helper. As opposed to the mainstream media giving us dodgy facts again. Carry on, Theo Usherwood.
So I've been speaking to a few of those who are making their way now across, just getting to Lambeth Bridge, and then expect to be in Westminster Hall, at about 2 o'clock, 2:30 this afternoon. How long have you been in the queue, sir?
Do you want to ask one of the ladies?
No, yourself as well, sir. You've got the medals.
Yes, go for it. You didn't pop in one, John.
We all got in just before 8 o'clock.
Just before 8 o'clock.
Expecting a long, slow queue. And we were planning to be here all day. It's now 10:30. And we're nearly there.
You're not doing too badly. You've got a couple of hours to go, I understand.
Yeah.
But what's it been like for you? The whole experience?
The experience?
It's fun. We had such a good laugh and we made so many friends.
Yeah, and yourself, madam?
Yeah, absolutely. There's just such a lovely atmosphere.
And some people even brought, picnic stools because they're expecting to stay in the queue for a long time. Unfortunately, the stool wasn't the ideal one. It turned out to be a stool that was about 6 inches high.
Oh dear! But did it hold, or did it collapse?
It held one gentleman for. How many seconds were you on it? Yeah.
30 seconds. And now, but you're standing now, sir.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a really lovely experience to see London at a slower pace because you're so used to walking along the embankment, and to actually spend time admiring landmarks on what's a really well-crafted route. It's 2.5 hours in. It's felt like 20 minutes. It's a really, really lovely experience.
And what's it been like? I mean, just in terms of the atmosphere, because it's not melancholy at all, is it?
Not at all. It's a really sort of convivial atmosphere, but in quite sort of a reflective way.
I think as we get closer, it may get a little more sombre. But we're all still very aware of what we're doing here, and we've been talking about Her Majesty quite a lot, obviously, and just how wonderful everything has been handled, and how emotional the last few days have been, and what I think it is to be here today.
So if you are at the very back of the queue and you're listening on your mobile phone or an app, then you could probably expect 5 hours, 6 hours until you get to Westminster Hall itself, going by the numbers, the progress I've been given here at Lambeth Bridge.
That last accent, in case you were wondering, Theo, I'd say that lady hailed from somewhere between Kidderminster and Droitwich Spa.
She hailed from Staffordshire.
Oh.
The gentleman you heard who had the stool that collapsed on him had come down all the way from Snowdonia, staying in Birmingham on the way. And then, yes, got to and arrived here first thing this morning.
So it's a jolly mood then, clearly. I mean, I know we learnt that it'd be Shobden then, it'd be that part of Staffordshire. This is possibly not what people are tuning in for this morning, but it is a jolly mood. The idea that it is people are sort of trumpeting their suffering, which we touched on a few moments ago on the programme, it's clearly just not true in the case of the people that are actually in the queue, albeit that those of us who are hearing tales of 8-hour waits would be thinking that it was an almost form of penance to be in the queue. The people in it are rather enjoying themselves, you would say, I think.
Yes, I would say that I was at the other side, if you could call it that, as people left Westminster Hall, and many people that I spoke to were actually in tears.
Yes.
Very emotional from having filed, and they only had 3 or 4 minutes on either side, filing either side of Queen Elizabeth II's coffin, and it was clearly, for those who had completed the journey, a very moving experience. Some people I tried to speak to couldn't even speak, they were so overcome by emotion, James. So whilst at this side of the queue people are talking and they're remembering and sharing memories with friends, people though they'd never actually met before today, at the other side, when people have actually made, if you want to call it a pilgrimage, you could call it a pilgrimage,
yes.
Had made that pilgrimage, there's a real sense that actually a sense of loss, of grief, having actually filed past the coffin itself.
Theo Ashwood, many thanks indeed. 10:55 is the time. As promised, paying proper attention this week to events in Ukraine, which probably top the list of things that we would be talking about a lot more were it not for such portentous events at home. Jack Watling is a research fellow for land warfare at the Royal United Services Institute, and he joins me now. Land warfare, of course, being precisely the field of expertise that you need to have a proper look at what's been going on in Ukraine. I'll ask you a slightly unfair question, Jack, if I may. Did you see the events of last weekend coming?
I've been working with the Ukrainians very closely since before the war. So I was there through August and going through a lot of planning with the general staff. And so I wasn't taken by surprise in terms of the axis, but it went much better than expected, even by the Ukrainians.
Why?
Well, because they induced shock, essentially, in the Russian forces. So even though the Russians did have units, quite considerable numbers of units in Izium, they were surprised themselves. They lacked artillery, and therefore they broke and ran and were very, very ineffective. This was always a possibility, but it's not something that you can be analytically confident of before you test it. And so you can't plan with that as the assumption when you're conducting an operation.
Because war is not science.
There are many scientific aspects to it, but as you say, there is a lot of art as well.
How do you, historically, I don't know what precedents one would draw, but how do you pull off a surprise on this scale? What was their sleight of hand? I've read that they were perhaps leading the Russians to believe that efforts were going to be concentrated on other areas, and that push was not expected in that part of the country. But in this universe, at this point in history, whether just because of technology and everything else, I would have thought it would be very difficult to do a feint like that.
So the Russian military has been suffering from abysmally low morale among its infantry for some time. And the result is that they need to compensate for their infantry's unwillingness through the use of a lot of artillery.
Okay.
Now, when the long-range rocket systems started to destroy the ammunition dumps, the Russians had to be much more careful about where they put those systems. So they built up those systems around Kherson in the south, where they were anticipating the Ukrainians to push. And therefore, even though actually the Russians did spot that there were Ukrainian brigades massing in Kharkiv, and they were talking about it, they didn't anticipate that there would be this very sudden thrust because they didn't think there were enough of them. And they also couldn't have moved the artillery systems necessary and the ammunition to support them that would have been necessary from other sectors quickly enough. And so this was a failure of judgment on the Russians' part rather than a failure of information. They had the information.
Understandably, Jack, a celebratory air surrounding the coverage and the success, but of course behind that lies some pretty grim discoveries, as we've discovered previously when Russian troops have been driven out of previously occupied areas. Evidence of war crimes emerges pretty quickly, and Izum is no exception.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's two distinct things that go on. The first is the FSB's plan, which involved physical liquidation of individuals they considered problematic.
Civilians they considered problematic, we should probably stress.
Local officials, that kind of thing. So this was a campaign of murder, which was pre-planned. There's a secondary line of effort, which is the suppression of resistance and partisan activity, as the Russians would frame it, which is often achieved through collective punishment in the Russian military. So if they think that people are gathering intelligence upon them, they don't necessarily care whether the people that they kill are the person that was responsible, because they still have the psychological effect on the community if they kill a whole bunch of people. And this sort of behavior has been replicated in a lot of places in Ukraine.
Does it have an impact morale-wise on Ukrainian soldiers, that these sort of discoveries?
It's had a very significant effect on the Ukrainians.
Yes.
It has hardened the determination to resist. And in places like Severodonetsk, this meant that there was a political requirement for them to hold ground even when it wasn't very tenable. So this has cost the Ukrainians casualties. But it has also meant that it has underscored the fact that this is an existential struggle for them, and is probably very counterproductive for the Russians, really, because it highlights to the Ukrainians the costs of losing.
I think your use of the word existential slightly preempts my final question, but I'd be interested in your answer anyway. And forgive me if it's a little simplistic. What has surprised you as someone who is both expert in the field of land warfare and close to the Ukrainian army? What has surprised you most about them?
About the Ukrainians?
Yes.
I think the interesting thing about the Ukrainian system is how their military has transformed just during the course of the war. There is a narrative going around that, everything the Ukrainians have done as a result of planning. Actually, a huge amount of it has been improvised, built rapidly, and you've seen the integration of civilians with skills into the military very quickly. Watching them work as teams is both a privilege and very impressive, and something that I really think we can learn from at a small scale. So, I mean, I could list hundreds of things where it's been surprising. But I would also highlight the Ukrainians have surprised themselves. I was sitting down with them before the war, and lots of things have not panned out as they expected. So there's a learning process that's going on inside the Ukrainian military that's quite extraordinary.
Thank you, Jack. Jack Watling, Research Fellow for Land Warfare at RUSI, the Royal United Services Industry. And all our guests this week have been exceptional, which is a mark of how hard my producer works in order to make sure you're getting the information you need to have a proper understanding of what is unfolding in Ukraine, when so much of the British media is understandably and correctly dedicated to events considerably closer to home. It's 11:01. 5 minutes after 11 is the time. As things stand, you will, I hope, be delighted to learn that Mystery Hour is scheduled to take place from 12 o'clock today, your usually weekly opportunity to achieve the sort of satisfaction not ordinarily available anywhere else on your radio dial, albeit inevitably and perfectly correctly last week we decided, well, I say perfectly correctly, I made the decision. I don't know if it's for me to say that it was perfectly correct, but we didn't do it last week for for obvious reasons. We'll be keeping an eye on the queue, however, and on events of import should they occur. And I turn your attention next to another royal story, because, as I explained at the top of the hour, I feel that my gears are malfunctioning when it comes to non-royal stuff at the moment. It's as if you're fed an unleavened diet, I think it got to page 38 of the Daily Mail today before I reached a story that wasn't about the Queen or her family. And I'm not criticising that, I'm not offering an opinion, that's just counting. But it explains why the front page of the Financial Times has a powerful story about Kwasi Kwarteng contemplating a policy designed to give bankers bigger bonuses. One of his first acts as Chancellor of the Exchequer, potentially to give the highest paid people in the country higher pay. Incredible. But even as I say it to you, I don't feel the sort of aligning of the cogs that I would normally feel as I prepare to get informative and incensed about something despicable happening in our country. Those gears are not working for me this week, and it's Thursday, so I doubt they're going to kick in properly until next week, which is why, if you're wondering and you've just tuned in, we are today, although not all week, looking largely at royal-based stories. This one is not. This is a royal story we could have at any point. It's not like the queue. It's not unique to this week or indeed this day. It's about the woman Meghan Markle, as was the Duchess of Sussex, as is. And I've got two reservations about having this conversation. The first is, I never know how much store we should set by social media bonfires, however huge they may appear to be. But that concern is assuaged by the fact that some household name, quotes, journalists, end quotes, in this country have grown very fat of late upon the diet of abusing this woman for reasons that continue to elude me, and abusing her in the vilest ways. And the second reservation I have is that today is Prince Harry's birthday. And it would therefore perhaps be inappropriate to have a conversation about why so many ghouls and vampires have such a problem with his wife. But I've decided that it's unlikely Harry will be listening today. I know he likes to tune in whenever he's in town, and he's a devil for the podcasts. But I'm fairly confident that he won't be listening live to the programme today. And even if he was, he would find nothing to complain about from what I have to say about him and his wife. Indeed, I think Prince Charles put it extremely well during his address to the nation last Thursday night. Here it is. Friday, was it? Sorry. Last Friday night.
With Catherine beside him, our new Prince and Princess of Wales will, I know, continue to inspire and lead our national conversations, helping to bring the marginal to the centre ground, where vital help can be given. I want also to express my love for Harry and Meghan as they continue to build their lives overseas.
And these people who describe themselves as fans of the royal family, or as monarchists, or as royalists, choose a day like today or a day like yesterday to abuse the man and woman that Charles himself, the King of England, King Charles, chose to describe his love for in the most clear and incontrovertible of terms. And that's part of the confusion I have about these people. How can you think that you're showing support for the monarchy by being vile about someone's son and daughter-in-law? People who he has expressed his love for in the most public way imaginable. What is it that you think you're doing when you condemn this couple? I'm saying you. I doubt you're going to ring me. You're more than welcome to, but we're probably going to do a they of it. Do they think that Charles is sitting there in Buckingham Palace, or wherever he sits at the moment, lying about how much he loves his son and daughter-in-law, and loving it when Doris Buncher-Numbers with a Union flag avatar on Twitter attacks his son, his beloved son and daughter-in-law? Is that what is the thought process that's going on here? Do these people think that they are show? Because I can't think of anything that's less royalist. I mean, it's treasonous you really want to get medieval about it, to slag off the king's son and daughter-in-law in this way, to speak about them in such a disgusting and vitriolic fashion, to pick over their every pronouncement and step as if it is some sort of affront to British values. And the reason I'm coming to this story today is because I cannot get my head around how disgusting these people are. I'm not going to mince my words. I think you are truly disgusting. On the occasion of someone's grandmother's funeral, and I'm using the word funeral to describe the events of the whole week, okay, not just the coming events of Monday. Or we could say death. On the occasion of someone's... Let's run through the facts, shall we? Right? Let's just get this absolutely right. We are talking about someone who has lost his grandmother at a time when divisions in the family are still raw. So the grief, the loss, the bereavement is exacerbated by the knowledge that the peace that had once reigned in that family has been diluted, has been diverted. So that's point number one. He's lost his grandmother, right? And he's been living abroad, so he wouldn't have had as many conversations with her as he might like to have had. Number two, when he was 11, he was compelled by, quotes, protocol, to walk a child, a baby, to walk behind his dead mother's coffin. A mother who was killed, he believes, rightly or wrongly, at least in part, by the uncontrollable, the insatiable attentions of journalists, British and foreign journalists, who pursued her into a tunnel where the car crashed. Now, the car was being driven by someone who was drunk, and there are obviously questions to be asked about both that and the fact that seatbelts weren't being worn. It's not a simplistic conclusion to arrive at. But if your mum died, how would you feel if I came along and told you that your opinions about your mum's death were worthless or wrong or mistaken? Oh, yeah, all right. Yeah, look, I know it was your mum, mate, but come here. You know, I've got a TV show. Let me tell you what... It's just gross. It's not funny. It's not fair. It's not journalism. It's disgusting. It's vicious and it's vitriolic. So that's point number two. Royal funerals for him must be absolutely unbearable, because that 11-year-old boy is very close to the surface in a week like this. That traumatised and, in my view, appallingly treated 11-year-old boy, wheeled out to walk behind that coffin, largely because the PR disaster of the royal family's response to the passing of Diana, Princess of Wales, needed to be assuaged. And what better way to assuage it by having her heartbroken boys walking behind the coffin at an age when they wouldn't be allowed into most films on release in this country, at an age when he'd be barely into secondary school in this country, before he'd sat a public exam, before he was considered old enough to, never mind drive a car, he wouldn't be old enough to... you can insert your own example here of just how youthful he was. So that's point number two, the trauma of attending royal funeral or funereal events. Unbelievable. Number three, because I don't think this would matter particularly to him, it's his birthday today. And number four, he is the son of the king that these people claim to revere or respect. And do you know what they did wrong yesterday? Do you know what these vampires and ghouls are complaining about? This boy, this man, who had to walk behind his mother's funeral at the last event. Not the last event, because he lost his great-grandmother as well, didn't he? But the event that he will be most reminded of this week would have been the most traumatic and heartbreaking event of his life. Do you know what they're complaining about? I bet you can't even guess. If you're not across this story already, I bet you can't even imagine what these vicious, vile individuals are complaining about today. But they're definitely not racist. Definitely not racist. Oh, no. No. We'd be this disgusting about anybody if they held hands on their way out of church. That's patriotism for you, according to Meghan Markle's critics. That's reverence for royalty for you, according to Meghan Markle's critics. That's commitment to the monarchy for you, according to Meghan Markle's critics. A man who has suffered the unimaginable pain of being compelled to walk behind his mother's coffin in the eyes of the entire world, held his wife's hand as they came out of a ceremony that would have brought back memory after memory after memory of the worst day of his life, or the second worst day of his life after discovering that he'd lost his mum. Now flip it, all right? And look at it from her point of view. A woman who has been exposed to more abuse from the British media than anybody else I can think of. And I am not exaggerating when I say to you, I would include child killers in that analysis. In terms of paragraphs dedicated and pages counted, vicious, vile criminals have received less abuse and less criticism from the British media than the daughter-in-law of the new king. And she's back in the spotlight, back in the crucible where she knows every single sniff and comma will be attacked as if it were an affront to the entire nation. A woman whose wedding bouquet was described as potentially poisoning her bridesmaids because it contained identical flowers to the bouquet carried by her sister-in-law, the wife of Prince William. And guess what happened when she had the cameras pointed at her? Guess what happened when the eyes of the British media and elements, disgusting, shameful elements of the British public that treat her in the most unimaginably horrible way? Guess what happened when she found herself back in that spotlight once again? She took her husband's hand. And I will never know where these people get off unless you tell me. That's your challenge between now and 12 o'clock. What do you think explains the... I almost hesitate to use the thought process phrase. I don't think it's a thought process. What do you think explains the behaviour of people who today have taken it upon themselves to be vile and obnoxious and disgusting about a husband and wife holding hands? What is it that's going on there? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. That's all I want from you. But just explain it to me. However unpleasant your analysis may be, however unwelcome your explanation may be, these people are queuing up to attack two people. Crikey, have they put some foots wrong? I'm sure they have. Some ill-advised adventures in public life, probably. I don't follow things as closely in those circles as I follow other things. But my goodness me, I kid you not. Think of the most prominent critic of Meghan Markle in this country and then count the criticisms or the condemnations that they have uttered with regard to, and you can pick whichever one you want, whether they're in a newspaper or on the telly or just on social media, and then try and explain to me why they reserve more vitriol and viciousness for her than they do for terrorists. It's incredible. Why do the newspapers do it? But to focus, to go in like a laser today, what possesses people to publicly complain about a couple holding hands? A couple who have been through all of the things that I have just described to you. And the couple whose gravest offence, as far as I can tell, is apparently being so happy. Because there is no greater revenge than happiness. Go on, give us a call. It's 11:20. And I'll tell you something else, actually, that you've probably clocked, but just in case you haven't. The reason why the NHS has cancelled operations and stepped down events on Monday, which I'm 99% certain the late Queen wouldn't have wanted. The reason why companies like Centre Parks have got themselves into such an almighty mess. The reason why everybody, pretty much, the world and his wife, is terrified of being sort of publicly attacked for not being mournful enough the reason why is precisely the sort of quotes, journalism end quotes, that direct such vicious hatred at Meghan Markle. Subconsciously, we're all thinking, God, crikey, I wouldn't want to get 0.0001% of what she gets, so we better shut Centre Parks. I wouldn't want to get 0.00001% of what Meghan Markle puts up with from the Daily Mail and the Sun and the rest of them. So we better advise all cyclists to get off their bikes during the course of the funeral. I wouldn't want to get 0.00001% of the abuse that Meghan Markle gets. So we better actually cancel operations on Monday. That's what it is. This is a society utterly corrupted by bullying, by the, I don't even know what the word would be, the psychotic hatreds of half a dozen men who either own or edit newspapers or have edited newspapers in this country. And it has now infected almost every level of our existence. And there it is. How dare a husband and wife hold hands during a really, really difficult time? What's going on? 03456060973. Nida is in Perivale. Nida, what would you like to say?
Hi, Jay. I was just watching this unravel throughout the past few weeks. I think it's just a sense of entitlement that the British public has over Prince Harry's life, as well as William and Kate. But I think Prince Harry chooses to, have a boundary when it comes to what he feels like he should do or should not do. So I think being in the public eye, there's also racism, but the British public definitely think they're entitled to an opinion.
Like a sort of you're probably too young for this, but like a sort of Yoko Ono syndrome, which was also misogynist and racist in many ways as well. But it was also about ownership, and she's taking away our boy somehow.
Right, exactly. As if they have any, it feels like to them, almost like a parasocial relationship where they feel like they know him and they know, him inside out, and they don't know anything about him really.
No, but that would explain the royal quotes experts end quotes better than anything as well, in that it kind of makes a mockery of the whole system, doesn't it, by refusing to play the game. Where though, and listen, you're not, maybe you are a psychologist, but you haven't said so. How do they think that they are, by causing hurt to Harry's dad? I mean, no one is going to enjoy seeing the abuse being heaped upon them, especially not this week. How do they manage to square the idea that they are fans of the royal family, supporters of the royal family, when they are routinely emptying buckets full of abuse all over them? Because you hurt my child, you hurt me. You hurt my daughter-in-law, you hurt me. You hurt my grandson, you hurt me. Where do they? How does that get past there? What passes for their brains or their consciences?
You know what? I think it's that they don't even think what they say have consequences on people. I think they just say it without, realizing that
never mind the facts, feel the fury.
Right, exactly. It's almost as if, what they might also be under the impression that Harry's dad or whoever have the same feeling towards Meghan and Harry that they do. Because there's really it's very hard for Buckingham Palace or Clarence House, anyone to make a statement when it comes to any rumours or scandals that are thrown around. So there's never really any clarity. It's always a grey area. So that leaves room for people to just say what they want without thinking that.
I have to disagree with you there. If the palace had wanted to, either Buckingham or St James's Palace, to call the attack dogs off Meghan Markle, they could have done. And Harry knows that, and that is the absolute root of the fracture. The fact that they let it go and maybe even counted their blessings and thought, well, if she's the one getting the kicking, then we're golden.
Exactly. I agree on that, definitely.
And the public go along, or elements, uncountable elements of the public, and some very prominent media figures are absolutely never happier when they are abusing this youngish couple, this youngish, loving, outwardly very happy couple. There's an insult involved in their behaviour as well, a perceived insult, I think, in that it makes people feel really stupid about deference. It's like, well, we all know our place. And this is the system that keeps chaos at bay, is what we spoke to John to you about earlier. This is why fascists love uniforms and pageantry and great big military displays. The more we love, keeps every, yes. And then someone supposedly at the pinnacle of that pyramid or very near the top of it says, this is actually rubbish, I don't want any of this, how the hell is that going to make someone who's doffing their cap and tugging their forelock at the bottom of the pyramid feel? Bloke at the top says it's rubbish and he's walking away. How are you going to feel if you're there, dividing your time between visiting a food bank and writing love letters to the royal family? You're probably going to think, hang on a minute, if he doesn't have to put up with this, why the hell do I? And rather than address that moment, that glimpse of self-realisation, you're going to attack the people holding up the mirror. Paul's in Ipswich. Paul, what would you like to say?
Well, I agree with you, actually.
You sound surprised.
For the first time, actually. No, I'm only joking.
Get out of it. Off with his head.
I mean, I was saying to your researcher, I've come off of Facebook. I'm slowly coming off. I'm just downloading pictures and videos that I want to keep that I've had on there.
Yeah.
I've had enough of the nastiness and the vicious comments that people leave and think, but there's no consequence for what they say.
But this is people you know, though, Paul, is it?
No,
okay.
This is people I know. This is people I don't know.
Okay.
And there's no consequence. There's no repercussion for whatever they say. They can say whatever they like on the internet, on Facebook, and nothing gets done about it. But, these are vile comments that don't need to be said. I mean, thankfully don't know people like that. My mother, I know my mother-in-law doesn't like Camilla.
Oh, okay.
She was a Diana fan, and my answer to her was, well, I don't think Camilla really cares.
Well, here's... you should say she speaks very highly of you.
Yeah, but I mean, I like Camilla. I think she's, Meghan and Harry are two people that are in love. They both needed support when they come out of the church, so they held hands. So what?
Yeah. I know. I mean, so what? It's spluttering incomprehension from me. What could possibly be wrong with that? Answer: it doesn't matter what they do. These people are going to find some reason to be hateful and some reason to be vicious.
Constantly, all the time, and the media love it when they can start a little storm going and people react to it, and that they love it. They crave for that.
But they also fall into line when they're told to, and actually the example of Camilla is wonderful for this, because if you think back to when everybody shared your mother-in-law's opinion, and when she was public enemy number one, and she very much carried a lot of the can for the mourning of Diana, Princess of Wales, and it is not by accident that her reputation has been completely and utterly rehabilitated. So if they wanted to have done that for Meghan, if they wanted to move those forces to defend her and to protect her, they could have done, and they didn't. And that's when Harry ran out of road.
Maybe now Charles is king, maybe he'll do that.
Maybe he will. I don't know, but I think
he might. I think he might, because,
it would be great, wouldn't it?
At the end of the day, it's his son and his daughter-in-law. I mean, she's a lovely-looking woman. I don't see what everybody's problem with her is. I really
she speaks very highly of you as well, Paul.
I mean, if it's colour, then you really need to go and educate yourself.
No, beautifully put, mate. And I'll leave the if standing. I'll just point out that I think two other couples held hands yesterday. Zara Phillips and her husband, Mike Tyndall, and I think the Prince Edward and his wife held hands as well. But they haven't been attacked, so I guess you would, to go with Paul's if, you would have to wonder what it is about them that makes people condemning Harry and Meghan for holding hands stay silent about them holding hands. I can't quite put my finger on it. Holly Harris is here now with your headlines. 11:35 is the time, so there it is. I'll just run through it once again before Claire and Sheeda join in. But it's his birthday. We can put that down as a relatively minor consideration. He will have almost certainly some form of post-traumatic stress disorder about royal funerals, given that at the age of 11 he was essentially ordered to walk behind his wife's coffin because his mother's coffin, because the PR surrounding the royal family's response to that had been so awful. And he's just lost his grandmother. Something that everybody would find very difficult to deal with. And then from her point of view, she's been exposed to more abuse from the British media than anybody else in living memory, up to and including her stepmother-in-law, Camilla, the Queen Consort as she is now. But the abuse subjected upon Meghan Markle is absolutely off the scale. I've never known anything like it in my life. And remember, I was a tabloid newspaper journalist 20 years ago, and she wanted to hold her husband's hand. And some people have taken it upon themselves to get enraged, publicly enraged, which is a very odd way of showing your commitment to, support for, or loyalty for the couple's dad and father-in-law, or the couple's family, isn't it? Or indeed for their late grandmother. Claire's in Kennington. Claire, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi. I think that in a way you're a bit guilty of this false news thing. You've been reporting about the time of the queues, which is actually shorter than it's being publicised, and it's been sensationalised. Because I've read some of the stuff online today. Admittedly, I don't buy newspapers very often anymore. And I don't think they're having a massive go at Meghan Markle. I think they're just pointing out that that's what happened. And from my point of view, I'm not a royalist. I'm not a particular. I like to watch these things because I think they're sort of majestic and they're historic important. And I am sympathetic towards what's happened to him and his mother, but as part of a very formal procession. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they were the only couple to hold hands when they were in Westminster Hall as part of that very formal part of the procession.
I know that Zara Phillips and her husband held hands in the hall as well.
They weren't in the processional bit, though, were they?
What difference does that make?
Because I think, it's being televised. It's part of this big show of monarchy.
Yes.
And it's very, very formal. And, everyone else managed not to do it. And in that way, I think
they didn't want to.
Self-indulgent.
Self-indulgent?
Yeah, I think it's a bit self-indulgent to feel the need to hold hands when they're part of such a formal bit of the procession.
Is there a place we can go to find out when it is and is not acceptable to hold hands with your wife? Because I'd hate to get it wrong myself at a family funeral.
I know it must be absolutely horrendous.
But where do you get your where are you getting your guidance from on this?
I just think the fact that people have noticed it suggests that you don't do it quite then. But I agree, it must be really difficult to actually follow every royal protocol, especially if you haven't been brought up as part of it.
It's the part of the day that they did it in, because I've got pictures in front of me of other couples holding hands in exactly the same room.
From my perspective it is, because I think it's much more noticeable because it gets broadcast around the world.
But you've only noticed it because
we're in Westminster Hall.
You've only noticed it because you looked up all the people being horrible on social media. You don't read the newspapers and you didn't notice it yourself on the television.
Well, to be fair, I think I have noticed it in certain situations.
We're only talking about one situation, aren't we? What other situations are you thinking of now, Claire?
Look, I'm quite a tactile person myself, and I'm a big believer in.
Don't hold your husband's hand at your grandma's funeral, whatever you do, Claire, because people like you will be slagging you off on national radio. No, it's not different.
It is. I think it is different. I think
because they're better than you,
and it's in Westminster Hall. No, because it's a show, and if you're going to be part of that show,
right? You
just need to.
So, what were the other examples you were thinking of a moment ago?
In sort of formal situations, I guess. But I'm not saying that it's only necessarily only then. Well, as part of the processions and things like that, I think they tend to be more. Slightly more tactile, and I think it is more noticeable. But it's only because
and you have a problem. You have a problem with that. Why?
I don't have a huge problem.
Why
with
have you
it,
rung me then?
In many ways, because I think my point is that it's being televised, and in that particular point. At that particular point, it's the majesty of Westminster Hall. It's the history of it.
Yeah.
And they are very formal, aren't they? That's the way they do it.
Yes, but I mean,
and some of it is horrible, and it was horrible that he had to walk behind his mother's coffin.
Here is Zara and Mike Tyndall walking up exactly the same room, holding hands.
Come on, James. I've already made that point.
What point is it you think you've made? That they did it 10 minutes earlier, so it's okay. If they'd done it 10 minutes later, it wouldn't be.
They're not part of the formal procession, and it is formal, and therefore be formal. That's my point.
Okay. And finally, my point again is where does one go to find this guidance? I mean, on what basis are these people deciding that it was inappropriate behaviour?
Well, I think I agree with you that it must be a minefield.
Also, if he's not allowed to wear his uniform, is he still subject to all the other protocols as well?
I don't think anybody actually knows the answer to that, do they?
Well, you do.
No, I don't know the answer to it.
But here you are.
I know, but you're trying to make it very sort of black and white. Or,
no, I'm not.
I'm to the other.
I'm quite the opposite. I'm trying to understand why anybody would ever have a problem with two people holding hands.
Because I just think that was just such a formal occasion, that you just need to not do it.
What do you think the Queen would have said?
I think she's very politic, isn't she? And I think
I'd like to hold hands with my wife. I'd like to hold hands with my wife, Grandma. Is that okay with you?
Maybe if she'd have been there, they wouldn't have done it. I don't know.
If she'd been there, there wouldn't be a funeral, Claire. I think we can all agree on that. But if she was asked her opinion by her grandson, who said, "I'd really like to hold Meghan's hand at this point in proceedings. How do you feel about that?" What do you think she would have said?
I don't know. But
do you think she would have said, "Well, let's check with Claire. Let's check with Claire in Kennington"?
No, I've told you I don't know the absolute answer to when and when you shouldn't.
I think you do, really. I think it's your grandma's funeral, and you want to hold your wife's hand. I don't even think there's a debate to be had or a conversation to be had, and I think you probably know that deep down. But I respect you, and I thank you for having a crack at trying to explain the behaviour of these ghouls and vampires, and you know, we must put on the record the argument that it's very, very different to do it at that precise point in proceedings as opposed to at previous or subsequent points in proceedings when other people did it. Ashida is in Greenford. Ashida, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. First of all, I want to say it is an absolute pleasure to connect with you over the phone.
We'll see.
I listen to you all the time.
It's early. It's early.
Có người lặng lẽ ngồi buồn, biển chiều hoang vắng.